Hamas and other radical Islamic groups in the region are the obstruction for peace. I mean, this is something that should be so obvious to anyone that's following the situation. But check out this clip over here with Adam Dayan over at Oxford, speaking to a crowd that is not particularly friendly to him, as he clearly articulates the case of this matter. Check out this clip, but before you do, hit that subscribe button over there in the corner. We'd love to stay in touch, and if you really want to stay in touch, at Pinchas Taylor on Instagram as well. Check this clip out.
Anyone who has a knife, a weapon, or a car, and is not attacking a settler or a Jew, and is not killing tens of Zionists, does not belong to Palestine. These were the words of the spokesman of Hamas, Fazi Barnoun, only this year. I say to you, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, that those are not the words of an organization seeking compromise. Those are not the words of an organization seeking conciliation. Those are not the words of an organization seeking peace. But before we move on to the arguments for those issues, I think we should sort out a definitional issue. So how am I going to define this debate? So I think that there are various parties involved in the effort to end the Arab-Israeli conflict. Two of these parties are Israel and Hamas. And the question of this debate is which of these two parties is more of an obstacle to the creation of a solution that is acceptable to all the parties involved. Now, I'm not here to claim that Israel's record is unblemished by sin. I completely agree. Settlements are an obstacle to peace. But, and this is crucial, they are not an insurmountable obstacle. We only need to look at Gaza itself, which Israel withdrew from in 2005, taking its settlers with it, that it's not an insurmountable obstacle. Moreover, the settlements in the West Bank are mostly in small blocks close to the border. They can easily be withdrawn from. The question is not whether it's possible, the question is whether it's possible to create the political will and the situation for this to take place. Indeed, the principle of land swaps was already offered by Israel at the Annapolis Conference in 2008. So given all of this, I'm going to explain to you why, although the road to peace is a hard one, Hamas is the principal obstacle on it, through looking at a few points. Firstly, Hamas's nature is inherently opposed to a solution to this conflict. Secondly, Hamas's discourse and how its rhetoric affects Palestinians and how Hamas affects Israeli political discourse itself. But before I move on to all of that, I think it's important to introduce the speakers in front of me. So firstly, speaking against the motion will be Kate Brooks, who is a DPhil student in international relations here at Oxford. Then we have Mishana Hosseinounu, who is a graduate of UC Berkeley, also just got a DPhil in international relations from Oxford, and is working with a team of international human rights lawyers to stop Saif al-Islam Gaddafi from being held incommunicado in Libya. And finally, we have Avi Shlayim, the emeritus professor of international relations at St. Antony's College, Oxford, and a fellow of the British Academy. Now, from that introduction, you might have gathered that there are a great number of PhDs sort of arrayed against my side of the house. But, ladies and gentlemen, I would tell you that I did receive an A star in GCSE history, and I did pass my prelims, and that's all you need to know. So, to move on to my substantive case, Hamas's nature and why it's deeply opposed to any sort of peace agreement. Firstly, Hamas are deeply anti-Semitic. We need only look at Hamas's Charter 7 of the Hamas article. It says, "The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. Then the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and the trees will cry out, 'O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him.'" This is in its very charter. Hamas is institutionally deeply anti-Semitic. And notice, they don't just hate Israelis, they hate all Jews as mentioned in their charter. This is clearly not conducive to brokering a peace agreement. Secondly, Hamas are implacably against a two-state solution. They are full of rhetoric that brooks absolutely no compromise. Listen only to their leader, Khalid Mashal, speaking in 2012. "Palestine is ours from the river to the sea," he said, "and from the north to the south, there will be no concession of an inch of the land." This is not just them saying we disagree with a two-state solution. This is them saying that there's absolutely no way we can come to that sort of solution. And if they go back on that word, then they sacrifice this huge piece of political capital they've laid on this claim. It's their unique claim which differentiates them from Fatah. They often attack Fatah for not being strong on the issue of being against a two-state solution. To negotiate? No, thank you. To negotiate is political suicide for Hamas. And indeed, their rhetoric is borne out in actions. They launched rockets at Israeli civilians. They dig tunnels to attempt mass attacks and to murder Israeli civilians. And they recently kidnapped and killed 3 teenagers. But also to move on to their effect in the Palestinian domestic political scene. Hamas constantly is filled with the rhetoric I've just given you earlier attacking a two-state solution. But this is worse than even just personally opposing it. They're creating structural opposition to there ever being a two-state solution. How so? By dominating the media with a narrative that is anti the two-state solution, through cartoons, newspapers, and sermons that are consistently anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and anti-peace. What they create is a situation where they can never get their people to agree to a solution, to a peace agreement, even if they wanted to. Even if the rhetoric we heard earlier is just for politics, they've created such a deeply anti-Israel sentiment in their own populace that it would be impossible to sell them any sort of peace deal. Indeed, they've got additional incentives not to compromise. On their radical flank, they're attacked by Islamic Jihad, who are even more radical than them, and they're worried about losing support to them. And they're reliant on Iranian money that only arrives if they are consistently anti-Israel. But now, to move on to a bigger argument, I think, Hamas's effect on Israeli political discourse. So a small preface to this. Israel wants peace. Polls consistently show most Israelis support the two-state solution. One moment. Prime Minister Netanyahu's Dayan speech in the most right-wing university in Israel said that he was pro a two-state solution. And indeed, Israel's negotiation record shows this. Ehud Barak in 2000 offered 95% of the West Bank plus land swaps for peace. Don't you think that's a big step for peace?
No. If Israel plans to have peace and to evacuate the settlements, why are they still building them?
So, as I spoke about earlier, most of the settlements are in blocks close to the border that could be dealt with in land swaps. But moreover, the point that Kate makes is in fact adds to my persuasive argument that I'm about to bring you about why Hamas gives fodder to the Israeli right, the people who want to build the settlements that she thinks are damaging the peace process, and Hamas's existence is something that bolsters the right-wing narrative in Israel and is the only thing that allows them to keep on building these settlements. So, if we move on, to successfully sign for a final status agreement, Israel must build some sort of political consensus for a deal. So if we can imagine in a simple model, there are left-wing people who are going to support any deal, whatever the situation, basically. There are right-wing people who believe that God gave them the land, and they're going to be implacably opposed to any deal. But the vast majority of Israelis, as evinced by the fact that 60% of Israelis in a recent poll support the two-state solution in principle, the vast majority of Israelis are in that center. They're mostly secular. They believe in the principle of a two-state solution, but it needs to be shown to them that it can be done while protecting their own security. And so, how has Hamas undermined the possibility of building a coalition like this, a coalition that is essential for peace? Well, they play into a right-wing security narrative. Their constant rocket attacks, suicide bombings, and kidnappings make Israelis feel fear. This is a fear that plays into the discourse that right-wing Israeli politicians constantly use. We can see the rhetoric from the Israeli right centers on a fear of a Hamas takeover of the West Bank. In fact, they're so fearful of it that they've created a word for it, Hamasistan. Indeed, if you look at Naftali Bennett and the right of Likud, their critique of a two-state solution constantly focuses on the possibility of Hamas taking over. And so what's Hamas done with their extreme actions and with their extreme rhetoric? They've made it impossible to win the center ground needed to build a pro-peace coalition. This means, because of Hamas's actions, that it's very, very difficult for Israeli politicians to gather the kind of support needed to get the consensus to deliver a difficult but worthwhile peace deal. Moreover, Hamas is an Islamist terror organization, and this strengthens the right-wing claim in Israel that Hamas is the same as ISIS. It's completely understandable the Israeli public are unwilling to negotiate or agree to a deal with an organization of that ilk. And so, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at what I've told you today. Hamas is a terror organization that is fundamentally, inherently, and implacably opposed to a two-state solution. This makes it impossible to build both a Palestinian coalition for peace, because Hamas's rhetoric has so changed and warped Palestinian domestic discourse. But moreover, it makes it impossible to create an Israeli coalition for peace, because the constant fear of Hamas, the constant fear of attacks, the security fears, mean that Israeli politicians can't gather the consensus needed to push forward a difficult deal. So, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I tell you today that a vote against this motion is a vote against Palestinians, a vote against civilian lives, but most importantly, a vote against peace. Thank you.
The notion of a two-state solution is something that was on the table until October 7th. Even those that were open to the idea of giving land for peace in the hopes and the dreams of having a peaceful coalition, I think October 7th was an eye-opening experience, even to those that ordinarily would be open to such a thing. When Gaza was completely run by Hamas, was self-governing in its own right, it just became a bed of terror. And the concern is that going forward, any two-state solution that would be proposed wouldn't simply be an argument, dispute over land territories. It would just become a hotbed for terror. You can't make peace with people that don't acknowledge your existence and don't want you to be there, and will always reject your right to exist as an entity. So it's a non-starter in a conversation. If you like this content overall, hit that subscribe button over there in the corner. We'd love to stay in touch with you. If you really want to stay in touch, @Pinchas Taylor on Instagram. We'd love to stay in touch that way as well. Take care.